Okay, looks like it's the appointed hour here, so I'll welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for taking time away from the Grey Cup. Can tell who's got their priorities in order today. Um, so I'm Matthew Fraze, volunteer within this together. I just want to welcome everybody. Alyssa Bender and I will be sort of co-hosting the event tonight. Hopefully everybody's got their sort of technology setup sorted out. If you do have any tech questions, you should be able to see there's an account here, ITT Peter, that's Peter Niemeyer. He has tech questions in his name afterwards. If you're having any trouble, you can send a question to him and he'll do his best to help you get sorted out. If you are struggling, especially with the audio, it can be helpful to send a message through the chat because that often works when the audio is still a bit of a struggle. Glad to see lots of familiar names and faces here. So tonight's event is Faithfully at Variance, Engaging with the Confession of Faith in a Mennonite Perspective. And today we're engaging with the confession that's in current use in Mennonite Church Canada. So this is my copy here. Some of you would have a copy with a blue cover. That's a little older, I think. So although we know In This Together includes folks from multiple Anabaptist groups, so you may not all use the same confession, but hopefully there's something here for everybody to engage with. We're having kind of a broader start, especially looking at kind of where confessions come from and what they're for, that I think should be interesting and helpful for everybody. So I'll start with just sort of a brief land acknowledgement. So I'm here in Winnipeg. So I live on Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I also have ties here to other treaty territories. So here in Winnipeg, we get our water from Treaty 3 to the east of us, out at Shoal Lake, where I've spent a little bit of time, Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. And somebody told me yesterday our power comes from mostly a region of Treaty 5, which I don't know very much about yet. So Treaty 5 is on my list to sort of learn more about. And I think we know we've got folks here from different parts of the country. I see folks for sure from Manitoba and Ontario, and I think Saskatchewan. I'm not sure if we've got folks from further west yet, but we would welcome if you know kind of the land that you're on and you want to share it in acknowledgement in the chat. You'd be welcome to do that. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. So everybody's going to be muted today except for the hosts and speakers. And we'll invite you to offer questions via the chat. We have some folks who'll be recording those questions, and we'll engage with those at the end after the two presenters. And so we will be recording this intro, which is already being recorded, and we will be recording the presentations, but we won't be recording the Q&A portion. Just want to keep everything conversational and relaxed and let everybody speak freely, both in offering and responding to questions. And then I'll just say we want to offer an invitation here to a time of curiosity and learning. One of our In This Together values is an openness to transformation, inviting people to invest in their own learning and change. So we'll invite everyone to remember that the 1995 confession, like all of our earlier confessions, are work of the people of the church in various times and places. And both the church and the individuals within it have continued to grow and change in the last 30 years. So today, I don't think we'll talk a lot about Article 19, which is often the kind of crux of these conversations, often a source of angst. Today, we'll take this kind of broader view because we're wanting to dedicate this session to talking about that broad question of what confessions are for and how did we get here? It's this historical context. So we'll also have two future sessions you should keep an eye out for in, I think, January and March. We'll engage more in questions about sort of the impact and the way that confession has been used, and then also about what to do sort of going forward in the future. So we'll allow space for those things at those sessions there. So there's sort of a past, present, future structure across the three sessions. And one last bit of framing, and I promise this is actually the last bit. So we won't be taking up any questions today about just sort of fundamental issues of LGBTQ plus inclusion in the church. That's not the focus of the session. If you do have any kind of questions about that, and if that's where you are, you can feel free to reach out separately to us, and we can connect you with resources or set up a conversation if that's helpful for you. But that's not the focus today, so we'll be kind of digging into that. So I will introduce our first speaker. So we're very pleased to have Karl Koop with us. Karl is the professor of history and theology at CMU, Canadian Mennonite University here in Winnipeg. Karl is also the co-editor of Vision, a journal for Church and Theology. Karl has written and edited articles and books in the field of Anabaptist studies, and I know he's written in particular about confessions, and I will spotlight Karl and invite him to begin.
Hey, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be in conversation with you about the role of confessions and creeds and how we got to where we are today. Many years ago, I was on Mennonite Central Committee assignment, and I happened to be living in Berlin, Germany. During my stay in Berlin, I was given an opportunity to attend a monthly theological colloquium at Humboldt University. And here I was invited to speak about my Mennonite faith tradition. I used the Confession of Faith in a Mennonite perspective as a way of introducing my own tradition to fellow students, most of whom identified as either Lutheran or Reformed. My denomination had just recently adopted the confession, and now I had an opportunity to see how this statement of faith would be received in an ecumenical setting. Then several years later, while teaching at Canadian Mennonite University, I had the opportunity to use the Confession of Faith again, this time with graduate theological students from Iran, who of course were Muslim. With my colleagues, I was teaching a course in Mennonite systematic theology. In both of these cases, in these ecumenical and interfaith conversations that I was having in Berlin and then later at CMU, the Confession of Faith was quite helpful in explaining Anabaptist and Mennonite perspectives. The confession provided a framework, a starting point, a language that facilitated the conversation that we were having. It gave those of us who were presenting an opportunity to explain the range of perspectives in the Mennonite Church, and we could share our own perspectives. We could also explain that the confession was a historical document coming from a long line of confessional statements that had been revised several times over the centuries. Our Muslim students were truly curious about the fact that our confession might actually be superseded or at least revised in some form by another statement of faith within a generation or so. This gave some of us who were teaching an opportunity to press the point that because contexts change, because we find ourselves in different situations, our thoughts about God and the world also change. As individuals and as a community, due to life experiences, we are on a journey that can lead us to new understandings and perspectives. This is, in fact, the nature of all religious experience and expression. Confessions of faith play a number of roles. They can be used to orient faith communities. They can be a basis of conversation, for further theological reflection and learning. But of course, confessions of faith do not always function in these kinds of positive ways. Sometimes confessions can cause much personal grief. They can cause conflict. They can marginalize. They can create division. In what follows, I want to very briefly talk about the ways in which theological statements, creeds, and confessions of faith have emerged in the life of Christian experience, and how these doctrinal statements have played different roles in different times and places. Giving attention to where we come from might provide some direction regarding how we as a Mennonite community might move forward. In the context of worship, early Christians expressed their faith in Jesus Christ in the form of prayers and hymns, and in their liturgies by expressing their belief that Jesus is Lord. Often this form of confession was ecstatic and extemporaneous speech, but over time, charismatic expressions like this became routinized expressions and part of repeatable worship liturgies. The purpose of expressing one's faith confessionally was to express allegiance to Jesus Christ. Living in the first century under Roman occupation, when Christians stated prayerfully and emphatically that Jesus is Lord, they were also simultaneously and categorically stating that Caesar was not Lord. Eventually, longer statements of faith, like some of the early versions of the Apostles' Creed, were used for the purposes of catechesis. Early Greek Christians in the Roman Empire seeking baptism would not have had access to the Bible as we know it. The New Testament in its final form was not well established until the 4th century. Manuscripts that may have been accessible would have been confusing, as the Bible is sometimes confusing to us, especially if you think of it for Hellenist Christians previously immersed in the worship of many Greek and Roman gods. And so a confessional statement, such as the Apostles' Creed, was a helpful and mercifully brief summary of basic Christian convictions. The catechumen, a person wanting to be baptized and learning what Christianity was all about, would follow a spiritual mentor and would become acquainted with the creed and thus find their way into the life of the Christian community. At baptism, the creed was used as a public confession of faith and then experienced again through the church's liturgy. Early versions of the Apostles' Creed were also intended to fight heresies. For example, there were Christians in the early centuries influenced by Platonism and Gnosticism, philosophical and religious ideas that denied that Jesus came in human form and that he had actually suffered and died and that he was associated with God, the God who had created the world. Gnostics had trouble believing in a human Jesus because their belief system taught that all flesh, all materiality, all of creation was intrinsically evil. The Apostles' Creed then functioned as a statement of faith intended to counteract Gnostic beliefs. If we were to pay attention to the Creed today, especially to it, and then also to its historical context, we might note that the Creed makes a fairly strong argument for creation care. A few additional observations can be made about creeds in general. First, the creeds from this era were primarily a reflection of what Christians already believed and understood in the context of their worship and spiritual life. In the order of importance, worship came first, and then the creeds followed. As the saying went, lex oriendi, lex credendi, the law of prayer dictates the law of belief, not the other way around. Prayer and liturgy come first. Creedal statements are second chronologically and in order of importance. Further, in reciting the Apostles' Creed, when Christians said, I believe, this was not expressing cognitive or intellectual assent to doctrine. It was not committing oneself rationally to a list of propositions. The word credo, meaning I believe, was much more about saying, I put my trust into this God who is creator of heaven and earth. And it was about pledging allegiance to this Jesus, the Son of God. It was a pronouncement about faithfulness and trust. And third, in confessing their faith, Christians did not assume that the creeds of the church were the pathway toward understanding God fully. They did not claim that the creeds were complete in what they expressed. Early Christians believed that God was beyond their grasp, beyond their understanding. This humility that was exhibited by early Christians and by early theologians was an expression of what we might describe as apophatic theology, a way of knowing that is about unknowing, a conviction that God is not fully knowable. Like the Apostle Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12, Christians of the first centuries believed that they only saw through a glass dimly. But of course, the creeds did not always function exactly in these sorts of ways. Some early Christian leaders wanted doctrinal uniformity, and certainly some emperors wanted political stability above all else, and believed that this could only be achieved through religious uniformity. In the Greek and Roman world of the 4th century, the emperor Theodosius wanted political uniformity, and so he demanded that all Christians should follow the teachings of the Nicene creeds, which included the creed adopted at Nicaea in 325 and the creed adopted in Constantinople in 381. In this case, these creeds were used by the state and by the church as a way of exercising power and dominance. Anyone not following this version of Orthodox faith, so-called Orthodox faith, was condemned to a life of discrimination and persecution. Unfortunately, minority Christian groups were marginalized and in some cases severely persecuted, along with other religious communities, including Jews. Already by the 4th century, Christian anti-Semitism was in full bloom. So we can see that the roles of the creeds, their function and their authority was context dependent, and the creeds could be used for good, they could be used for ill. When we get to the Mennonite confessions of faith in the 16th century, we are in a different setting and context, but there are some similarities as well. During the Reformation, the confessions of faith that Lutherans, Reformed, and Mennonites produced were much greater in scope and breadth than the creeds of the early church. And typically, these confessions of faith included at some length and detail the whole range of Christian teaching, from God and creation to the end of the world and teachings about the last things. In the context of the Reformation, Christians in each tradition, Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican, Mennonite, and even Roman Catholic, had to figure out what it was that they believed and what distinguished them from the others. In this context, Anabaptist groups adopted confessional statements for the purposes of identity formation. We often assume that Anabaptist communities were primarily concerned about practical Christian living, including the values of discipleship, peace, justice, service, toleration toward others, and so on. Or that they were concerned about the inner spiritual life. All of this is true, but this is not to say that they were dismissive of beliefs and convictions expressed in words. Faith was meant to be expressed in deeds and in words. Confessions were used for the purposes of catechesis, that is, for the purposes of instructing the young. They were used to orient persons in leadership positions, to unite groups and churches that had been in conflict and had not yet been reconciled. Sometimes confessions were used to give witness to the state authorities, in which case they effectively became statements advocating for religious toleration. Sometimes they were used in the context of ecumenical dialogue. Noteworthy is that Mennonites over the centuries seem to have had no problem in revising their confessional statements, and they did this many times, further nuancing their views in matters having to do with Christology, church discipline, attitudes towards the state, and in the 20th century in matters having to do with creation and evolution, with women's head covering, and so on. Throughout, it is also evident that confessions of faith did in fact define certain boundaries. In a sense, when we were teaching Muslims about Mennonite theology at CMU years ago, we were paying at least some attention to boundaries. On the one hand, we noted similarities between Islamic and Mennonite faith. On the other hand, we noted some major differences about the authority of Scripture or the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection. The confession of faith was helpful for us in that we could see more clearly where the points of convergence and the points of divergence were. So attention to boundaries can be helpful when engaging in interfaith or ecumenical conversation. It should be noted that the boundaries that we discussed with our Muslim friends did not hinder our relationship. Our frank discussions and attention to boundaries strengthened our relationships and bonds between us. There are times, however, when paying attention to boundaries can be harmful. That is what happened in the 17th century in the Netherlands when a segment of the Mennonite community insisted that all ministers adhere closely to the Mennonite confessions that had been adopted at that time. And as I'm talking here, I can recall also where a confession became a point of difference. Also, when the Amish and Swiss Anabaptists separated at the end of the 17th century. So there was a segment here in the Netherlands when the Mennonite community. There was a segment in the Mennonite community that insisted that all ministers adhere closely to the Mennonite confessions that had been adopted at that time. And as it so happened, there was another group that refused, in principle, to give the confessions that kind of role, that kind of authority. This disagreement led to a major split in the Mennonite churches between the so-called confessionalists and the anti-confessionalists. Unfortunately, on both sides, churches and individuals subsequently experienced forms of marginalization and assault on their character. And so, in the history of the Christian church with its creeds and in the history of the Mennonite church with its confessions of faith, there has always been the possibility that confessional statements can do much harm and they can do much good. There's potential for good or for ill. Both directions are possible. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karl. Sorry, I was just struggling with my Zoom controls here. Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting. The connection of building on the tradition of the creeds is very interesting, and the conflict with the confessionalists and anti-confessionalists was not something that was on my radar. So thanks very much for what you shared, Karl. And if anybody does have any questions, again, please put them into the chat, and there are folks who will kind of record that. We can pick them up at the end here. So I'll hand this off now to Alyssa, and she will introduce our second speaker.
Thank you. Thank you again, Karl. And also, we're very grateful to have Ann Weber Becker with us this evening. Ann served on the Inter-Mennonite Confession of Faith Committee back in the 80s and 90s for a long stretch, the group that was part of creating our confession. And in that time, she was on the pastoral team at First Mennonite Church in Kitchener. After the confession came into existence, she also, during a time of freelancing, wrote a book called Faith for the Journey, Youth Explore the Confession of Faith, and then went into education in her career, elementary education. Ann is a member at Rockway Mennonite Church, which you will find on our list of affirming churches on our website, and also participates in Burning Bush Forest Church, and I learned today plays in a fiddle orchestra. So, Ann, we're looking forward to you sharing some anecdotes with us and reflections on that time of development of the Confession of Faith. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Alyssa, and thanks for the invitation to join the conversation this evening. When Alyssa first reached out, I wasn't sure I could deliver this tonight. This involves recalling experiences 30 to 35 years ago, and we all know what happens to our memories over time. but I'll do my best to dust them off for you and recall things to the best of my ability. Let's start with some context to situate the confession in the life of the church. Years back, there were two large Mennonite denominations in Canada and the US, the Mennonite Church, MCs, and the General Conference Mennonite Church, GCs. Different regions tended to have either MC or GC congregations, but not always. Sometimes there were MC and GC churches in the same community. Some congregations even had dual membership with double conference affiliation. I feel like I'm really dating myself to remember the MC-GC distinction as being a thing, but it was. When Byron and I got married in 1983, it was not insignificant that I was of MC background and he was GC. In the early 1980s, the general boards of the two denominations were talking seriously about merging MCs and GCs together. And my understanding is that the idea of creating a shared confession of faith emerged early on to offer a common foundation going forward should the merger come to pass. There were other reasons to create a new confession. The previous confession felt too outdated to be a resource for the church. The last GC statement of faith went way back to 1941, and the previous MC confession of faith was a bit more recent, 1963. I don't have a copy, but the cover looked like this. 1963, but many perspectives, theology, and practices had changed between then and the 1980s. Also, there was a sense that a refreshed confession of faith might offer something to ecumenical dialogues. And Karl, it was really interesting to hear your firsthand stories about that. So in 1986, a committee was appointed by the general boards of the two denominations, and the committee worked together for about 10 years. So how exactly were committee members chosen? Good question. But the group of 12 included older and younger folks, women and men, pastors and laypersons, an attempt at cultural diversity, historians and theologians, and a range of theological perspectives. At the core of the committee was the writers group consisting of the two co-chairs, Helmut Harder and the late Marlon Miller, as well as Lois Barrett, who was our official writer. They met more often than the whole group. I wasn't part of the committee at the very beginning. The late Sue Clemmer Steiner, a friend and colleague who I miss dearly, stepped off the committee, and I was appointed in 1988 in her place. Sue and I were both pastors in Ontario at the time, and I guess I always assumed that they were interested in having a female Canadian pastor as part of the committee's composition. I also helped lower the average age. So you might say I ticked 3 boxes. My first meeting was in early 1989. I was 28 years old, 2 years out of seminary. I went to AMBS and was serving on the pastoral team of First Mennonite Church in Kitchener, where I was the congregation's first female pastor. Also, Byron and I were on the verge of starting our family. Our first son was born in 1980, and a second followed in 1994. So my time serving on the Confession of Faith Committee is closely entwined with those intense years of early parenting. I missed 2 meetings. One was held just days after our first son was born, not a good time to travel. And the other one was held just as I was returning from maternity leave from our second son, also not a good time to travel. Trust me, there are many stories that could be told about how we managed the logistics of those meetings. How did the committee work together? This was definitely a working committee with significant assignments between meetings. There was a flow to the development of an article. Each article began by 2 committee members independently writing a short essay on the theme. This essay was brought to the committee for discussion, and then the 2 then independently wrote a rough draft of an article, keeping the discussion in mind. These rough drafts were brought back to the committee and discussed. And all this was then passed to the writers group for refinement. And from that point on, the article continuously cycled back and forth over time between the whole committee and the writers group. Consultation with the church beyond the committee was a priority from the beginning. While we sometimes met in Chicago at a Travelodge motel with a sign announcing cheapest rates close to O'Hare, meetings were also held in different locations so that we could engage with folks in different regions of the church. Our work was regularly shared at church assemblies and through church papers, always looking for feedback. The big MC and GC conference gathering in the summer of 1995 was our deadline. Throughout the process, I remember the committee meetings as being very respectful, orderly, and quite intense. We worked morning, afternoon, and evening. It was like going through seminary a second time, sometimes speaking, sometimes listening, pushing and pulling back, clarifying and imagining. I always arrived home exhausted, but in a good way. Over time, the structure and arrangement of the confession emerged. There would be 24 articles clustered into 4 sets. The first 8 articles deal with themes common to the wider Christian church: God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, creation. The second set of articles deal with the church and its practices: ministry and leadership, baptism, the Lord's Supper, foot washing. The third set is aspects of discipleship. This is where Article 19 lives. And finally, a single article in the 4th set, the reign of God. Interestingly, the reign of God was one of 3 articles that did not appear in previous Mennonite confessions. I think I might want to cross-reference with you, Karl. The article on Christian spirituality was new, as was a second article on creation to deal with the special privilege and responsibility of being created in the image of God, including care for God's creation. Are you familiar with the internal structure of each article? Each theme has an article and then a commentary as well. Each article contains about 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph functions as a summary of the article that follows, so it would be possible to skim through the booklet reading only the first paragraphs, and you'd have the major theme of the article. In fact, a summary brochure is available that does just that. It's just 2 sides of 1 page with the first paragraphs of each article there. The commentary goes into more detail on certain portions of the article for those who want to go deeper into a theme. I'd like to backtrack a bit and call to mind what was and wasn't available as we worked away at this 30+ years ago. I was happy to have access to a home computer with word processing, but I don't think everybody did. When I first joined the committee, I didn't yet have my own email account. Byron did at the university, so there were times when I spelled out his email address over the phone, then he would print off my correspondence and bring it home to me. And of course, we didn't have the option of meeting virtually like we are now. I know the organizers worked hard at economizing our meetings, and so our part was to work as hard as we could once we actually got together. As we approached the end, a draft of the entire confession was shared through the church. Perhaps some people present remember this booklet with a response survey. And I believe no Google Doc or anything here. There it is. And I think the complete draft went out to the congregations early in 1994, along with a study guide in the builder. I found all kinds of things in that box in the attic. This generated a massive amount of feedback. I can't quantify, the amount of response we got, but it was enough to fill a binder like this not just the responses, but the responses were coded. So every response found a line here according to the line in the confession, and then there was a number at the end that let us track it to the original response. The final draft was significantly shaped by this church-wide feedback. A joke within the committee was that the most common feedback went something like this: "It's too long, and you forgot one important thing." A few examples of how that feedback shaped the final product. In the 1993 version, so this one that went out to churches, Article 9, entitled "The Bible," appears in the second set of articles. Recall that the second set relates to the church and its practices. It leads with the line, "We believe the Bible is the inspired book of the church." In response to significant objection to starting this way, the article was revised to reflect a more traditional approach to the Bible's interpretation. The final version reads with, "All scripture is inspired by God." There was also a shift in name and placement. Instead of the Bible, it was renamed Scripture and repositioned in the first set of articles right after God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit. Article 21 also tells a story. The 1993 version is titled "Sabbath and Jubilee Living" and brings right into the article the Old Testament practice of Jubilee, when every 50th year brought justice and mercy by the return of land to the family whose heritage it was, the releasing of debts, and the freedom for bound laborers, end quote. This content is still there, but it was moved to the commentary section. By my reading, the revised article has more of a spiritual vibe than a justice vibe and bears the new name Christian Stewardship. Honestly, comparing those two versions of the article would be a good task for ChatGPT, and I almost got that done for this evening, but just didn't quite get it done. I'm not sure if I'm doing the comparison justice, but those were my distinct impressions as I looked at them in preparation for tonight. The third article, Ministry and Leadership, attracted some concern that congregations would be required to ordain women to pastoral ministry. The committee pointed out that the word "may" is used, allowing flexibility in the matter. At last, the summer of 1995 arrived. We packed up our two little boys and their car seats and flew to Kansas for the Wichita 95 Joint Convention. At the delegate sessions there, the decision was made to move forward with integrating the MC and GC conferences, and the Confession of Faith was essentially adopted. Soon after, it was published in this form, and then has since been published in with a different cover, but the content is the same. Our committee disbanded, and the Confession of Faith and Mennonite Perspective was released into the world. Our fervent hope was that the confession would nurture the church, helping to build a foundation of unity within and among churches. I can remember the life-giving metaphors for use that we hoped would be realized as the confession lived in the church. We hoped that it would serve as a magnet, drawing people together, that it might be like a well or a stream, offering refreshment and sustenance. A living letter is another metaphor I've heard used. Indeed, there are some sections that still give me life. The God article names love as the lens through which we see God and the path upon which we approach God. And the fourth paragraph describes the many ways God reaches out to creation, always in the context of love. I continue to be intrigued by the article on spirituality, placed as it is at the beginning of the discipleship section. It gives voice to a reflective, lived faith. Article 6, the creation and calling of human beings, was used by a church leader who devoted much of his career to educating others about creation care and the urgency of building sustainable practices. Despite his personal conviction that environmentalism was rooted in faith, at the time he was having difficulty finding this clearly articulated by Mennonite theologians. He found it in this article and told me once that it helped him to anchor his work. These are a few examples of some parts of the confession that continue to offer me life-giving sustenance. On the other hand, the confession was not meant to be a fence. Yet, in some cases, this has been the disappointing reality, especially with that one line in Article 19. And it has given me great pain to see the confession used to define boundaries and to exclude. 30 years later, I have many questions about how the confession has and could be used, but I'll limit myself to 4 questions. Why has there been a hyper-focus on one line in Article 19, but not other lines that could be pulled out? For example, Article 6, the creation and calling of human beings. We believe that human beings are created good in the image of God. And Article 1, the God article, leads the confession with line 1. We believe that God exists and is pleased with all who draw near by faith. In light of these and other proof textable lines, why the spotlight on that one line in Article 19? I wonder if the 1963 confession was used as a fence. Perhaps it was, but that wasn't my experience when I was exploring ordination in 1990. This was still our current confession, 1963, and stated that men and women have been given differing functions. Men are to lead, women are to nurture and serve with their hair left long and their heads covered. Rather than fixating on that, my congregation was supportive of my ordination. And I just observed that the interval from 1963 to 1995 is roughly equal to the interval between 1995 and now. Is the church content with a confessional statement that is 30 years old next year? Does it still reflect who we are? What might fall away? What might be added? And I have to wonder, will there be another consensus document giving voice to faith and practice at a denominational level? If so, I wonder what it might look like. This has felt like a bit of a romp, but I hope my stories and observations help flesh out this confession that has lived among us for 30 years. I'd like to close with something of a thought experiment to demonstrate how, in my experience, static words carry only so much meaning. In my youth, the hymn Just As I Am, set to the tune Woodworth, was used at revival meetings to work our young consciences. I do apologize if this was someone's favorite hymn. I truly do. But in my experience, this hymn felt manipulative and fence-like to me. Just As I Am appears and voices together. It's 2 verses shorter, but there is an alternate tune suggested by James Clemens, Oh Wally Wally, a traditional English folk melody. It's lighter and lilting. The pairing of the same text with a different tune actually calls a different meaning out of the words to my ear. Used differently, they now refresh like a stream of water. Even though we worked hard on the words for this confession, I'd suggest that all who pick up a copy become co-creators as we bring it to life in our personal and corporate journeys of faith. I hope this background will be helpful to you, and I welcome your responses and questions.
Thank you so much, Anne, especially for that invitation or reminder of being co-creators. I appreciate that and the other images and metaphors that you raised for us. I appreciate that. So this is the end of our 2 formal presentation times. So as we move into the question and answer time, I'll ask Leah to turn our recording off.